The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening. Our webinar update, PCBs in the Hudson, presented by Riverkeeper staff attorney Abigail Jones, will now begin.
Great. Thanks, Dana. Hi, everybody, and good evening. My name is Abby Jones, and I am a staff attorney with the Hudson River program here at Riverkeeper. I wanted to thank you all for taking time this evening to join us for this update on PCBs in the Hudson. One of the things, over the past 40 years or so, we've noticed a lot of people upriver and downriver really, commenting on the contamination of the Hudson River and in some respects turning their back on it. You can't fish in it, you can't eat the fish, and we here at Riverkeeper just think that's a travesty. So what we wanted to do tonight is give you guys an update on the status of the PCBs in the river. I apologize, something popped up on my screen here. And yeah, so just give you an update on PCBs in the Hudson and where everything is and where things are going. We get calls here almost every day asking about the cleanup that's being undertaken of the PCBs in the Hudson River by General Electric. And so we feel that it was finally time to give the update to the public. Tonight's webinar is intended to give you the update not only of the status of the PCB-GE cleanup, but also what's slated to be done over the next couple of years in the future. And hopefully at the end, we should have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So what are PCBs? PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls. The manufacture of PCBs was banned in the U.S. in the late 1970s. PCBs were widely used as fire preventative and insulator in the manufacture of electrical devices like transformers, capacitors, and the like because of their ability to withstand exceptionally high temperatures. PCBs build up or bioaccumulate in the environment, increasing contamination levels as the contaminant moves up the food chain. PCBs are considered probable human carcinogens and are linked to other adverse health effects such as low birth weight, thyroid disease, and learning, memory, and immune system disorders. PCBs in the Hudson River sediment also affect fish and wildlife. The primary health risk associated with PCBs in the Hudson River is the accumulation of PCBs in the human body through eating contaminated fish. Since 1976, high levels of PCBs in fish have led the New York State Department of Health to close various recreational and commercial fisheries in the Hudson River and to issue advisories restricting the consumption of fish caught in the Hudson River. Now, you can't taste or smell PCBs in the fish, and therefore there are no immediate health effects such as sickness upon eating the fish, but PCBs do persist in the environment and in the body due to the bioaccumulation of PCBs, mainly in the fat of the fish. So the Department of Health that issues the fish consumption advisory has recommended that if you do catch fish and if you are allowed to eat them, that you trim as much fat as you can off of the fish. And contaminated fish can have up to thousands of times the amount of PCBs found in the water or the sediment. Now, the DOH's, the Department of Health Fish Consumption Advisory for the Hudson River, can be a little confusing, but it can be basically boiled down for the purposes of this presentation to the following. Women under 50 and children under 15 should not eat fish or crabs from the Hudson River. For men over 15 and women over 50, the DOH's advisory depends on where you fish. In the upper Hudson River, the rule is take no fish, eat no fish. In the mid-Hudson, the rule is 1 meal per month of alewife, rock bass, blueback herring, and yellow perch. Don't eat any other fish, including striped bass in the mid-Hudson region. Now, in the lower Hudson, it's a little more lax. and you can eat a number of recreational fish, including striped bass, white perch, and carp, up to 1 meal per month. Don't eat white and channel catfish, American eel, and gizzard shad, but you can eat up to 6 blue crabs a week. So now let's turn to GE and PCBs in the Hudson specifically. Superfund is the name given to the federal law which requires the cleanup of the nation's most contaminated sites. That law provides for the liability of persons responsible for the releases of hazardous waste at closed or abandoned hazardous waste sites, such as in this case the Hudson River. In 1984, the Hudson River was designated the largest Superfund site in the United States, and this includes the entire length of the Hudson River, 230 miles, from the Hudson Falls to the Battery in New York City, as being part of the Superfund site. During a 30-year period until EPA banned the production of PCBs in the late 1970s, it is estimated that approximately 1.3 million pounds of PCBs were discharged into the Hudson River by GE from its 2 capacitor manufacturing plants located in the towns of Fort Edward and Hudson Falls, New York. And we have recently been told that after almost 70 years, GE is going to be closing its Fort Edward plant and moving its operations to Florida. So the Hudson River Superfund. Briefly, I'll run through the procedural history that got us to where we are today. The Hudson River was initially designated a Superfund site by the U.S. EPA in 1984. After years of negotiation between the EPA, State of New York, and GE in 2002, the Record of Decision, or the ROD, was finalized. The ROD, or the agreement, is the document which explains which cleanup alternatives will be used to clean up a Superfund site. The remediation goals for the Hudson River Superfund site were based on fish consumption by humans and wildlife, and not on concentrations of PCB in the water, which is commonly done for river-based Superfund sites. The 2002 agreement called for the targeted environmental dredging and removal of approximately 2.65 million cubic yards of PCB-contaminated sediment in the upper Hudson River. Now that's a ton of PCB-contaminated sediment. In 2005, GE entered into a consent decree with EPA in which the company agreed to undertake the initial steps to remove PCBs from the Hudson River. In 2009, GE entered into another consent decree with EPA to continue to dredge the PCB-contaminated sediment, and that portion of remediation is currently ongoing. In 2012, pursuant to the regulations under the Superfund law, EPA undertook a 5-year review of GE's remediation. Riverkeeper commented with respect to the 5-year review, and our comments are available through the Riverkeeper website as well. Riverkeeper has been involved with the cleanup of the PCBs in the Hudson River since the beginning, and has played an important role in getting the site listed by EPA, as well as requiring the GE to clean up the contamination between 2002 and 2009 with the Record of Decision of the agreement and the consent decree. Now, we've been in this fight regarding remediation for well over 10 years now, and as I'll make clear during this presentation, our fight's not over yet, unfortunately. And I think Dana's putting up our the comments from 2002 or 2012, sorry, on the 5-year review. So just a quick background of the GE's remediation in the Hudson River. As part of the 2002 cleanup agreement for the Hudson River, the remedy was broken up into 2 phases, and the 40-mile cleanup area of the upper Hudson River was split into 3 sections. Within each of these sections, dredging is conducted in the areas that we call certification units, or CUs, and in the 40 miles of the cleanup area, there are 100 CUs. Now the river sections are based on different PCB concentration levels that need to be cleaned up by GE, with River Section 1 requiring the most stringent cleanup. This means that there will be higher levels of contamination left in River Sections 2 and 3. The target cleanup levels selected by EPA are listed on this slide and were chosen by EPA as levels that will bring the fish tissue concentrations down to the cleanup goals. Again, this is based on the fact that the remediation was determined on fish consumption, human consumption of fish, and not on the concentrations in the water itself. Based on a multi-year sediment sampling undertaken by GE beginning in 2002, GE determined that just under 500 acres of PCB contaminated sediment should be dredged. The dredging was initially estimated to take approximately 6 to 10 years to complete. And so here you can see a map of River Sections 1 and 2. River Section 1 goes from the Fort Edward Dam to the Thompson Island Dam, and River Section 2 goes from the Thompson Island Dam to the Northumberland Dam. As I mentioned, River Section 1 is the most contaminated section and required the most dredging. The dredging done in River Section 1 was almost completely bank-to-bank, whereas in some of the other sections, River Section 2 and River Section 3, it's more of a hot spot dredging. And that's because as you move downriver, the hot spots become more spread out and discrete. Here's a map of River Section 3, which goes from the Northumberland Dam to the Federal Dam in Troy. River Section 3, as you can see, is the largest section, and the hot spots of the PCB contamination here are much further apart. In the fall of 2012, I went on an EPA-led tour of the dredging operations, and the following slides are some of the pictures of the GE operations up close and personal that I took. Now, the typical dredging season is from May to November of each year, depending on weather, and the dredging occurs 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. I mentioned before that the remedy was broken up into 2 phases. Phase 1 of the dredging occurred in 2009, and GE removed approximately 10% of the total contamination at that time. The purpose of Phase 1 was to allow GE and EPA to evaluate the project progress and to make adjustments as needed to improve compliance with EPA's performance standards, and those standards include such issues as resuspension, residual contamination, and productivity, as well as human-based issues of air, noise, light, odor, and navigation. One of the most important things to come out of the Phase 1 section of the remedy was the realization that the depth of contamination was greater than expected, and that there's actually more contamination than GE initially found through its testing and modeling. After Phase 1, EPA reevaluated the dredging operations and made improvements for Phase 2 going forward, and Phase 2 is currently the phase that we're in. Now, the changes made included requiring GE to resample the area using improved methodology to give a more accurate and complete information on the extent of the contamination, both the depth of contamination and the location of the hot spots. GE was also required to adjust the depth of contamination calculations going forward for their dredging operations to give a greater assurance that all the PCB-contaminated sediments would be captured when they dredge. Other changes included limiting the times one section could be dredged so that the sediments were exposed for less time, and an overall reduction in the total amount of the PCB hotspots that were allowed to be capped, and that level was set at 11% maximum. Year 1 of Phase 2 of the dredging occurred in 2011, with Year 2 in 2012, and we're currently in Year 3 of Phase 2 of the dredging operations. During all 3 of these dredge years under Phase 2, GE exceeded the amount of sediment expected to be dredged. This is due in part because of the deeper contamination that was experienced when they actually got in the river and started doing the dredging. Now, as you see in this picture, GE dredges PCB-contaminated sediment using bucket dredges and barges. The dredge bucket pulls the contaminated sediment out of the river and then dumps the water and the sediment into the barge. After dredging, the areas are backfilled with 1 foot of clean fill and in some places capped with backlit riprap or stones. Locations, due to strength, there is no dredging and only capping, but these locations are few, and the overall capping for the project is well below the total allowable percentage. Although the capping percentage has increased steadily year to year. Once the barges are filled, GE then moves them upriver to its dewatering facility. Here's a picture of the dewatering facility that I took. It's located on the Champlain Canal in Fort Edward. Now GE dewaters, which means it separates sediment from the water. The PCB-laden sediment, it has already dredged, and then it ships the sediment to the appropriate facilities around the country via rail. The toxic hazardous waste is currently being sent to an appropriate facility in Oklahoma, and the water is then treated on-site before being returned to the Hudson River. This is the only dewatering facility for the GE PCB cleanup. As GE's dredging moves downriver and into River Section 3, the distance between the barges and the dewatering facility increased, and there was talk of using the barge-mounted dewatering facilities. But that proposal was recently rejected as being unnecessary, and they've continued to ship the dredged materials up to the dewatering facility in Fort Edward. And so here's an aerial picture of the dewatering facility so you can get a real sense of the scale of this massive operation. The pictures that I was just showing you were taken from the area at the bottom right of your screen where it's all those wharfs down there, but you can see that this site is just massive, ending in the rail yard area in the back. Now, at the end of GE's dredging operations, the dewatering facility in Fort Edwards will actually be decommissioned by GE. So, quickly dredging, what's been done by GE? As I mentioned, 2013 is Phase 2, Year 3. To date, approximately 1.8 to 2.0 million cubic yards have been dredged by GE, which represents approximately 2/3 of the total required to be dredged. And as I mentioned before, every year of dredging, GE has surpassed its annual goals in the dredge volume. And that's a great thing, and it just goes to show that GE has the ability and the capability to undertake not only the dredging that it's required to do, but additional dredging that may need to be done. And as a consequence of this very effective dredging by GE, the company has recently reported that it will likely be completed with its dredging approximately 1 to 3 years ahead of schedule. That is within the next 2 to 3 years. At the beginning of this season, they estimated 3 to 5 years. So I think that's a pretty good thing overall as far as the dredging is concerned that they're currently doing. However, the remaining dredging is the most spread out sections as well as those landlocked sections which cannot be readily accessed by barges. So while there may not be as many areas to be dredged, the dredging that they do have to finish will be more complex and will take a longer amount of time to complete. Now, throughout the dredging operations, GE has not had any exceedances of the water quality or resuspension standards as set forth in the 2002 agreement. And those are based on the EPA Safe Drinking Water standards of 500 parts per trillion PCBs in the water for 5 to 7 days. Now, there have been some daily exceedances of that standard throughout the dredging operations over the past couple of years. And in those cases, GE has slowed or actually halted altogether dredging while waiting for the levels to recede. But these exceedances were typically during times of heavy rains and heavy storm events, especially such as Hurricanes Irene and Sandy, and also occurred during when GE was dredging exceptionally highly contaminated areas. As well, monitoring of fish as part of the dredging operation has not shown any increase when compared to the pre-dredging levels. In fact, the dredging has not been shown to cause any recontamination of the river such as was initially feared when the remedy was being selected. Now, while we do see some increase in the PCB concentrations in the water immediately surrounding the dredging operations, we're not seeing any kinds of high-level resuspension downriver. Air monitoring of the dredging operations also occurs by GE 24/7, and they have had less than 5% exceedances overall, with odor, noise, and lighting monitoring occurring regularly or in response to complaints from the local residents. So under the 2002 agreement, GE is required to dredge the PCB-contaminated sediments, and they're also required to do habitat restoration, which includes planting of submerged aquatic vegetation, which is actually very locally sourced from the feeder canals in the Hudson River itself. So this is a very good thing for not only the remedies for the Hudson River, but also for the Hudson River itself using the local Hudson River vegetation. Now, as part of the agreement, there are some other areas that need to be remediated by GE. One of these is the Hudson Falls plant remediation, and that deals with on-site soil and groundwater contamination at the Hudson Falls manufacturing site. And that was actually covered under a separate agreement that was signed by the parties in 2004. This remediation includes soil removal and site water, groundwater, PCB recovery well systems. The groundwater recovery systems are already operating on the site in some locations, and the latest report on the Hudson Falls plant remediation is that the groundwater investigation report is under review, and the remedy selection should occur hopefully over this winter, with the soil remediation on the site to occur over the next 2 to 3 years. Additionally, GE is responsible for the remediation of the Hudson River floodplains, but this remediation is in the very early stages. They're still collecting soil samples, and there's been no kind of work plan or remedy selection. The process for selecting the remedy is slated to take place over the next 3 to 5 years. But there will be the opportunity for public comment on this portion of the remediation, the floodplains remediation. And Riverkeeper will be involved to ensure that the floodplains cleanup is sufficiently protective of human and environmental health, and we'll make sure that our members and the public are also involved with this opportunity when the time comes. So be sure to keep that on your pages, that there will be an opportunity to publicly comment on the remediation of the floodplains going forward. So that's a quick summary of what's been done with the GE remediation of the Hudson River. And now I'd like to turn to the next steps, what we expect to see coming down the pipe. So despite GE's successful dredging efforts to date, there are still a number of battles regarding the PCBs in the Hudson River. The three most important that are coming down are, one, the remediation of 136 acres of highly contaminated hotspots that are not included in GE's current dredging operations. Two, the remediation of PCB-contaminated sediment in the Champlain Canal, which is the navigation channel for the Hudson River. And three, GE's liability under the Natural Resources Damages Act, which is part of the Superfund law. So first, the 136 acres. And this is something that you may have seen a lot of press over in the past year or so, if not longer. Riverkeeper has issued some press releases that are available on our website to this effect as well. So in 2011, the federal trustees identified approximately 136 acres of highly contaminated PCB sediment that is outside of the GE dredge area that they're currently doing. The federal trustees identified this extra contamination based on both qualitative and quantitative analysis during GE's in-water operations, which revealed the high levels of PCB are much deeper and much more widely distributed than originally assumed by GE's testing. And this is what I mentioned this before. After phase one, was undertaken by GE, they realized that their previous modeling and sediment samples didn't capture fully the contamination of the Hudson River. And so through additional testing and monitoring and modeling, they discovered that there are additional hotspots that GE is not required to dredge as part of its 2002 agreement. And so a 2009 report by the trustees indicated that the post-remediation PCB concentrations in river sections 2 and 3 will be about 5 times higher than predicted by the EPA model. So what this means is that this additional 136 acres of highly contaminated PCBs that are not currently being dredged by GE have the possibility to significantly affect the health of the Hudson River going forward. And the 136 acres are mostly within 200 feet of the current dredging areas and are mostly, if not all, contained within river sections 2 and 3, those areas that are more discrete and more spread out. Now, Riverkeeper believes, and so do our fellow environmental groups out there, as well as many of the communities, that undertaking the dredging of these hotspots is not only necessary, but should be easy for GE, who year after year has shown that it not only has the ability, but also the capacity to undertake more dredging than was required or anticipated in the 2002 agreement. And I mentioned that Riverkeeper commented on the EPA 5-year review in 2012, and as part of its comments, Riverkeeper submitted our serious concerns about these additional 136 acres and the negative effect this contamination, if left unremediated, would have on the restoration and recovery of the Hudson River, and the likelihood that it would significantly inhibit the remedial objectives of the GE cleanup overall. Unfortunately, despite Riverkeeper's comments, which were supported by independent scientific review, and EPA's own acknowledgement that the current dredging plan will reduce PCB levels in the river by only about half as much as originally expected, EPA nevertheless refused to call for a reconsideration of that 2002 agreement and dredging plan. Nevertheless, Riverkeeper continues to press GE to do the right thing by the river and to clean up these 136 acres, either voluntarily or as part of the natural resource damages assessment, which I will cover in just a short bit. So where does this leave us? Riverkeeper continues to press GE to undertake the remediation of the 136 acres. This would not only ensure that the Hudson River recovers faster, but would likely result in a reduction of GE's future liability for this contamination under the Natural Resources Management Act. So moving on to number 2, navigational dredging. The New York State Canal Corps, or Corporation, is the state agency responsible for the oversight, administration, and maintenance of the New York State canal system, including the Champlain Canal and the Hudson River. Due to the presence of PCB contamination in the Champlain Canal by GE, the Canal Corps has been unable to dredge the navigation channel in the Hudson River since 1980. In addition to the sections of the Champlain Canal that GE is dredging as part of the 2002 agreement, which are not that many, a majority of the 136 acres that I just described are located in this navigational channel. And because of the inability of the Canal Corps to dredge the nav channel, the economic development of the communities along the Hudson River has suffered greatly for over 30 years. Indeed, as has actually been recently reported, that there is talk of a navigation-based barge development in some of the upper Hudson communities, but that development is based on the ability of the nav channel to be dredged, and at this point, the Canal Corps is unable to do this. Now, dredging of the Champlain Canal and the presence of PCBs in the Champlain Canal is of particular importance because of the astronomical cost of dredging and disposing of PCB-contaminated sediment. It can be for example, $4 to dispose of non-PCB sediment, it could be $400 to dispose of PCB-laden sediment. That's the difference, and that cost is something that the Canal Corps will have to either pay for by itself through the New York State taxpayers, or will somehow force GE to pay. In fact, earlier in this year, the Canal Corps filed an application for a dredging permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And this permit would allow dredging of the PCB contaminated sediments in the Champlain Canal to restore and maintain the state navigation channel to its previously approved width and depth. Now, Riverkeeper submitted public comments in favor of the issuance of the dredging permit, so long as the environmental and public health concerns are sufficiently addressed, and requested public hearing on the permit so that more members of the communities could be involved. A copy of our comments is available through the Riverkeeper website. And while we've been informed by the Army Corps that no decision on this application has been made yet, Riverkeeper will continue to track this issue and will continue to push for the restoration of our nav channel and the economic development of our river communities. If there is a public hearing on this application, we will be sure to let our members and the public know, and if possible, offer up draft comments that you could present. So moving on to the third step here, the Natural Resources Damages Assessment. So the Natural Resource Damages Assessment is also known as the NRDA, and is perhaps the most important next step in the remediation of the Hudson River by GE. NRDA is a second level of liability for GE under the federal Superfund law. And as a side note, some of you may remember from earlier this year, the New York State Comptroller, who is actually a large state shareholder in the company GE, forced GE to undertake a review of its potential liability under Superfund, and this includes any future liability under the NRDA. GE's report is expected to come out by December 30th of this year, but unfortunately, based on recent public comments made by GE over the past year, we don't really expect this report to be a sufficient assessment of their potential outstanding liability. But nevertheless, we will be sure when that comes out to review it and let you guys know that it's out and our take on it. So we're going to go into NRDA a little bit more in depth just because it is so important and that it will be really what's driving everybody with PCBs in the Hudson over the next few years. So we've made a lot of progress so far for the cleanup of the PCBs in the Hudson, but as you all know, and as this presentation is pointing out, that we still have quite a ways to go. And as I mentioned, the next big step in ensuring the restoration of the Hudson River is the NRDA process. Now, the purpose of NRDA is to assess and restore or replace natural resources injured by hazardous substances to provide for the public's use and enjoyment. So under Superfund, you clean up the hazardous waste that you left there, and then you actually compensate the public for the injuries done to the natural resources. There are two separate levels of liability under Superfund. The NRDA is undertaken by what's known as trustees. And for the Hudson River Superfund, the trustees include the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the United States Department of the Interior, as represented by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. Department of Commerce, as represented by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. The role of the trustees is to pursue damage claims for past, present, and future injury to the natural resources. And the trustees have resource management authority as the stewards of the public's natural resources and have the authority to resolve natural resource damages claims through either settlement or litigation. And finally, the trustees have the authority to implement the restoration that's picked as part of the NRDA process. Now, as for the Hudson River NRDA timeline, we're still in the beginning stages of this process, although the trustees have been collecting data for well over 10 years and have been issuing a few reports. Currently, the trustees are assessing the injuries to the natural resources, and they're identifying the scale and appropriate restoration alternatives that they will select. The trustees still need to resolve the actual damages claim, the monetary claim that they're going to impose upon GE. They need to develop a restoration plan, and they need to implement the restoration activities and monitor the effectiveness of the restoration. As part of the restoration plan, the trustees actually accept the public's input on what we think would be good restoration projects for the river. And this is something I know that we're going to be sending out an email following this presentation, and that email should have, and I think it's actually up right now on this little chat line here, but so you go through this website to propose either new or updated projects that you think would benefit the Hudson River and help restore it after the dredging is done as part of the NRDA here. So, as part of the assessment of the injuries under the NRDA, the trustees conduct rigorous scientific studies. Injury categories include biological resource injuries, which means injuries to mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, for example. It also includes the loss of navigational services, such as the Navigation Channel and the Champlain Canal, and includes remedy-caused injuries. Since 2001, the federal trustees has issued a few injury determination reports, and there are much more to follow, and these can be found through the trustees' website. Additionally, in January of this year, the federal trustees issued a report that confirmed that the entire extent of the Hudson River is extensively contaminated, and that the high levels of PCBs that remain present a serious and long-term threat to the health of the entire Hudson River ecosystem. This January 2013 report was presented at the Riverkeeper, Scenic Hudson, NRDC, and Clearwater Public Forum at Marist in January this past year that some of you may have attended. So as I mentioned, once the injury is assessed and the damages are determined, the trustees then develop and implement the Hudson River Restoration Plan. And this plan, as I mentioned, is developed not only through the ideas of trustees themselves as well as other federal state agencies, but through the additional restoration project ideas from the public. So that's a brief, hopefully brief, run-through of NRDA, the process, and what we should look for going forward. But now I want to talk to you about why NRDA is, why the natural resource damages assessment is so important to the PCBs in the Hudson. And it's quite simple. Due to the 136 acres that we discussed previously, the negative natural resource impacts associated with those additional hotspots that are not being dredged by GE, the trustees have recognized the potential to include both navigational dredging and what they're terming restoration dredging of these hotspots as part of the natural resource damages restoration plans. And this is something that's typically not done as part of an NRDA. So such dredging as a restoration can either occur after the ongoing remediation by GE is complete, or as Riverkeeper is strenuously pushing, to occur concurrently with GE's cleanup efforts. And for obvious reasons, many of which have been mentioned earlier in this presentation, it's quite beneficial for GE to voluntarily address its NRDA obligations at the same time as it's currently mobilized in the river and undertaking the dredging under the 2002 agreement. You know, these hotspots are, as I mentioned, within 200 feet of where GE is currently dredging, and it would save them time, money, and effort to use the current dewatering facility before they decommission it if they wait until the ongoing remediation is completed. Another reason that we're really pushing for GE to undertake this additional remediation now as part of the NRDA process is because that when everything's said and done, the NRDA process could take up to 10 additional years to reach some kind of settlement or even litigation regarding GE's liability, if not longer. So that's why it's imperative that GE and the trustees sit down now and negotiate while GE is still mobilized in the river. And GE has proven that it has the ability as well as the capacity to successfully undertake dredging in the Hudson River in excess of what was initially contemplated. But now it's really up to GE at this point to do what's right by the Hudson River. The trustees reached out to GE, in fact, about 2 years ago in 2011, and encouraged them to sit down at the table and begin negotiations about the NRDA liability. But to date, GE has just not been cooperative on this front. And every year that passes is another year that the Hudson River has to suffer. Therefore, Riverkeeper will continue to push for GE to address this now, this NRDA liability now, this 136 acres now. Otherwise, we could all the successful dredging done by GE to date could be for naught if the PCB contamination persists in the river with these 136 acres. So that's basically everything I have. It's what GE was required to do as far as dredging is concerned, how they've done the dredging and how they've been successful in that, and then what GE still needs to do to get the river as clean as quickly as possible. So here you'll see a list of websites where you can find additional information regarding GE's cleanup of PCBs in the Hudson River. It includes obviously our Riverkeeper website as well as a community advisory group. CAG is something that's for every Superfund site in the nation. These hold quarterly meetings in either Fort Edward or Saratoga Springs, and members of the public can attend those. I recommend that you do. Not only is it informative, but there is an opportunity to ask questions of GE, of EPA, of the federal trustees. So, and we can always send you information when those are coming down the pipe. So I just want to thank you all for taking your time out of your evening to join Riverkeeper and updating you on the PCBs in the Hudson River. And before I take questions, I just want to let you all know that Dana will be sending out an email afterwards that contains some additional information herein and some links to some of the websites and press releases that I've mentioned, as well as a recording of this webinar that you can pass on to your friends and family, anybody who's interested in this, and that you can listen to again as well. And I'm going to be turning to questions now, but if for some reason I don't get to your question, please know that you can with Dana or me, and we'll try to respond to you as quickly as possible. Okay, one of the questions is GE the only source of PCBs in the river? No, GE is not the only source of PCBs in the river, but the extent of the contamination by GE is the most, it's the most extensive there is. There are some other manufacturing plants along the Hudson River, both upriver and downriver, that added PCBs to the Hudson River, but not to the extent that GE did. And as you know, as part of the initial Superfund designation, the EPA really looked at who was responsible for the PCB contamination of the river, and it was decided that GE was the liable party under that law, and so that's why they're the ones responsible for the cleanup now. Would it be helpful for individual members of Riverkeeper to write letters organize demonstrations, or take other direct action to put pressure on GE to perform remediation of the 136-acre site. I think it would be really helpful for members of the public to, get involved in any way we can. Riverkeeper, along with our other coalition groups, Scenic Hudson, Clearwater, NRDC, we continue to press for GE and the federal and state trustees to perform the remediation on the 136 acres now while they're still in the river. And really, we're getting some good traction there, but we can always use support from members of the public. And to the extent that Riverkeeper feels that there's any action alerts that we can engage our members in the community in, we'll be sure to send those out to everybody. So if additional dredging, oops, sorry, I just kind of lost that. If additional dredging of hotspots and navigation channel is included in the NRDA instead of done now, would that mean that there would be less funds available for additional restoration projects to be funded? So the reading in this question, if GE does not voluntarily undertake the dredging of the 136 acres and instead chooses to negotiate some kind of agreement with the federal trustees to include that kind of dredging in the NRDA, it could mean that there could be less funds or not. Frankly, at this point, we're just not sure. The federal trustees are still working to assess the injury and then calculate the damages associated with all those injuries. So at this point, we just don't know what the impact would be for future additional restoration projects through the NRDA process. So unfortunately, I apologize that I can't give you a more affirmative answer to that question. It's a possibility that there could be some impact, but overall, undertaking this dredging would actually improve the quality of the river. It would result in a cleaner river sooner. It would result in people being able to use a river and start fishing again and start eating the fish. So overall, that's a pretty good thing that we have to look forward to. And that's why we want GE to undertake the dredging now, whether or not voluntarily or as part of the NRDA process. Can we get some more information and photographs of the 136 acres? I don't know if I have anything on hand, but I can certainly look for any kind of reports regarding the delineation of those 136 acres, and I'll work with Dana to get that out to you if I can find something. There wouldn't be necessarily photographs. It is, part of the dredging under the water, so it's nothing that you can see. But I will certainly make a note of that to see if I can get you more information exactly where those 136 acres are. Well, this is an interesting question. Do you think GE is friendlier to the environmental community now or not? Honestly, I don't know. Frankly, we haven't gotten a very good response from GE. They've not responded to the trustees' call to sit down from our knowledge. They haven't stepped up and undertaken this remediation voluntarily, even though we've been calling for it for a few years now. So I honestly, to admit, I wasn't here years ago, but I know that GE has been fighting this cleanup since 2002, since the initial remedy was selected. They really haven't stopped fighting this battle. So I don't know if they're friendlier now or not. I don't know if they're less friendly or more friendly. So I'm sorry I can't answer that question, really, but it was a good question. Okay, and there is another question about the 136 acres, a more detailed report. And again, I'll see what I can find and be sure that Dana and I reach out to you guys and send you the information that I have. Okay, is there an estimate on when it might be safe to eat fish from the Hudson River? So as part of the initial 2002 agreement and selected remedy, GE is going to be dredging the highest contaminated PCB sediments from the river, but there are going to be some areas of low-level contamination that will be left in the river. And so the second aspect of this cleanup has to deal with what's known as monitored natural attenuation, or MNA. And that's basically saying that we're going to remove almost all of the PCBs out of the river in this Superfund site. However, the PCBs that are left in the river and that are still in the fish bodies are going to, over time, decompose and naturally work its way out of the system. So even based on the 2002 agreement and remedy selected under there, it was estimated that there would be decades before we could eat the fish again without any kind of restrictions on it. And with this, additional 136 acres that's been identified of highly contaminated sediments, that's just going to push that estimate decades further down the line. So that's why it's so imperative that we get GE to undertake the cleanup sooner than later. Now is best. They're in the river. They're mobilized. They have the facilities up and running. Okay, next question. Is it safe to swim in PCB contaminated water? Yes. Most of the PCB contamination in the Hudson River is actually contained in the sediment. There's not a lot of resuspension in the water column itself, but even if there was, it's safe to swim in the Hudson River. PCBs are not something that we need to worry about when recreating in or on the Hudson River. However, I'm sure my water quality team here at Riverkeeper would want me to tell you that there are some things you do need to be careful about, especially after high rainstorm events such as come from sewers and sewer overflow. And we do have on our website something that you can check to make sure that it's safe to swim in the river. So be sure to check that if you want to go recreating after a big rainstorm. So just waiting a few minutes to see if we have any more questions come in. We're doing pretty good on time. I just wanted to, again, thank you all for joining us tonight. And to remind you that we're going to be following up with you. Dana and I will be following up with you. Oh, and there's our water quality data. Please check that out. It's very informative, and it's a great thing that we here at Riverkeeper do. So we'll be sending you an email following this webinar with a recording, and we'll also try to be following up with you regarding any additional reports and more detailed information on the 136 acres. And I just want to remind you all that, it's the end of the year and it's the holiday season, so there will be a link in the email to donate to our end of the year fundraising campaign. And I want to point out that up until December 31st, there is a match, a one-to-one match for all donations to Riverkeeper, so your gift will be doubled essentially. All right, so I don't see any more questions coming in. I'll give it a few more seconds, but like I said, if for some reason your question wasn't answered or you have a question that you think of afterwards, just shoot us an email and we'll try to answer it as quickly as possible. All right, that's it. I want to thank you all again and have a great night.